The Harley was the only thing Ridge Callow had left that still made sense. He'd restored it bolt by bolt in the dark, the way broken men rebuild what they can when everything else is gone. So when he unlocked the garage at 4:47 on a February morning and found a barefoot child curled across the tank, wrapped in his old Iron Saints cut like it was the only armor left in the world, his hand froze on the light switch for a full 10 seconds. She was 7 years old, maybe. Her feet were blue from the cold, and when her eyes opened, they didn't show surprise. They showed the calculating stillness of a child who had already learned that adults were something to survive. She looked at him and whispered 3 words that would cost Ridge Callow everything he'd spent 20 years trying to forget. Please don't send me back. Before we go any further, if this kind of story hits you somewhere deep, somewhere you didn't expect, hit that subscribe button right now. Every week, stories like this one live here. Raw, cinematic, built for people who still believe that someone, somewhere, will stand up when no one else will. Drop a like if you're already feeling it. And leave a comment. Tell me what city, what country you're watching from tonight. Because these stories are traveling further than I ever imagined, and I want to see exactly how far. Now, let's go back to Portland. Let's go back to that garage. And let's find out what a man does when the past he buried shows up barefoot and shivering on his Harley at 5 in the morning. Portland in February did not forgive anyone. The cold came off the Willamette like a blade, sharp and purposeful, sliding through every gap in every wall in every neighborhood the city had stopped bothering to maintain. Ridge Callow's garage sat at the end of a cracked asphalt alley behind a row of machine shops on Southeast Morrison, and at 4:47 in the morning, it was the only building in 3 blocks showing any sign of life. A single bulb hung from the ceiling rafter. A shop radio was bolted to a shelf above a pegboard of tools, volume dialed to low, tuned to a station that played nothing but old country because Ridge had never gotten around to changing it. He'd owned the garage for 11 years. In 11 years, he had never changed the station. He'd come in early because he couldn't sleep. That wasn't news. Ridge Callow hadn't slept a full night since 2009, and he'd stopped being surprised by that the same year he stopped being surprised by most things. He was 44 years old, which in his body felt closer to 60. 3 combat deployments, 1 dishonorable discharge that got quietly reclassified when the Army decided they'd rather not explain what really happened, and 11 years of rebuilding motorcycle engines with his hands, because his hands needed something to do, or they started remembering things on their own. He was 6 feet and change, lean in the way that wasn't healthy, with a jaw that looked like it had been broken and reset at least twice, and eyes that sat deep in his face like they'd retreated from something a long time ago and never quite come forward again. He pulled up the rolling door. Cold air moved in immediately, tasting of snow and exhaust. He reached for the light switch. He stopped. The 1978 shovel head he'd been restoring for the last 14 months sat in the center of the garage on its stand, chrome catching the distant glow from the alley light outside. And across the seat and tank of that motorcycle, wrapped tight in his old Iron Saints cut, the one he'd hung on a nail by the door 7 years ago and hadn't touched since, was a child. A little girl. Barefoot, sleeping. Ridge stood in the doorway for what felt like a long time, but was probably 8 seconds. He did not move. He cataloged the way combat had taught him to catalog. Small female, approximately 6 to 8 years old, dark hair tangled and matted, clothing underneath the cut that was too thin for the weather, skin on her feet gone pale and mottled from cold. No visible injuries from this distance, chest moving, breathing shallow but regular. Alive. He let out a breath and stepped inside. He didn't reach for her. He knew better than to reach for a child who was sleeping in a place they weren't supposed to be. Instead, he moved to the side of the garage, put the kettle on the hot plate he kept on the workbench, and waited. The country station murmured something about a highway and a woman who'd left, and the particular kind of loneliness that neither one of them had deserved. Ridge leaned against the bench and crossed his arms and watched the child sleep on his Harley, and tried to figure out what in God's name he was supposed to do next. She woke up the way animals woke up, all at once, completely, with no transition between sleep and full alert. 1 second her eyes were closed. The next they were open and fixed on him, dark brown and steady, and Ridge saw immediately that whatever was behind those eyes was not the expression of an ordinary 7-year-old. There was a calculation there, a reading of exits and angles and threat levels that no child should know how to perform, and that Ridge recognized because he'd done the same thing himself after the first deployment, waking in rooms and clocking the distance to every door before he remembered where he was. She didn't scream, she didn't cry. She pulled the leather cut tighter around her shoulders and looked at him and said nothing. Ridge said, "You're cold." She didn't answer. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said, because it needed saying even though he knew those words meant nothing. People who hurt children said those words all the time, and children who had been around long enough knew it. She looked at him for another long moment. Then she said very quietly, "Please don't send me back." 3 words, 8 syllables. Ridge felt them land in the center of his chest like something thrown hard from a short distance. "Back where?" he said. She pressed her lips together. Her chin dropped slightly. Not submission, he realized, but decision. She was deciding how much to give him. She was 7 years old and she was rationing information like a field operative, and that fact alone made something in Ridge's gut go cold and stay there. "The place," she said finally. "What place?" "Where Mr. Voss lives." The name meant nothing to him yet. He filed it anyway. "What's your name?" Another pause. "Maisie." "Okay, Maisie, my name's Ridge. Do you want some hot chocolate?" He didn't have hot chocolate. He had instant coffee and a tin of cocoa powder that was probably 2 years old. He'd figure it out. She watched him move to the hot plate. She watched his hands, specifically the way children who had been hit watched hands. Ridge kept his movements slow and deliberate, the way he'd learned to move around skittish horses on his grandfather's property in eastern Oregon when he was 12, the way he'd later learned to move through certain villages in Kandahar where sudden gestures got people killed. He mixed the cocoa and hot water and a spoonful of sugar and brought it to her in a mug that said Portland Trailblazers on the side. And he set it on the tank of the Harley within her reach and then stepped back and gave her space. She looked at the mug. She looked at him. She picked it up with both hands. Her hands were shaking. And drank. The garage settled around them. Wind moved through the alley outside, rattling something metal against something else metal, and the country station played on, and Ridge Callow stood in the center of his garage at 5 in the morning with a child he'd never seen before wrapped in his abandoned cut, and he thought about his brother. Danny had been 8 years old the last time Ridge saw him. 8 years old and terrified and being loaded into a county van by 2 caseworkers who wouldn't meet Ridge's eyes, while their mother sat on the front step of their rented house and stared at something that wasn't there. Ridge had been 17, old enough to understand what was happening, young enough to believe someone would fix it. He'd spent the next 27 years learning, slowly and painfully, and at considerable personal cost, that the systems built to fix things for children like Danny did not, in any reliable way, fix things. Sometimes they made things worse. Sometimes they made things so much worse that a boy who had survived an abusive home did not survive what was supposed to save him. Danny Callow had died in the Harlan County Group Home for boys in eastern Oregon in the winter of 1999. He was 14 years old. The official cause was a cardiac event. Ridge had never believed it and had never been able to prove otherwise. And that particular combination, knowing and being unable to prove, was the kind of wound that didn't close. It just scabbed over and reopened and scabbed over again. And eventually you stopped expecting it to heal and just carried it like a stone in your pocket, heavy and constant and yours. "Maisie," Ridge said, "how did you get here?" "I walked." "From where?" Her eyes moved to the garage door, the alley, the dark beyond. "A long way." "Are you hurt?" She shook her head. Then she looked down at her feet, at the blue-white skin of her toes. And something crossed her face that was too old and too resigned for her face. "My feet are cold." He found a pair of wool socks in the back of the truck he used for hauling parts. They went up to her knees. She let him put them on without flinching, which told him either she trusted him enough already or she'd long since stopped caring about strangers touching her, and he didn't know which possibility disturbed him more. He got the space heater going. He sat on an overturned milk crate 6 feet away from her and waited while she finished the cocoa, and the color slowly came back into her face. Outside, the snow had started again. He could hear it, almost nothing, just the particular quality of silence that meant snow falling on wet streets, muffling the city into something quieter and more dangerous than its usual noise. "Tell me about Mr. Voss," Ridge said. Maisie looked at the empty mug. "You don't have to," he said. "But if you want to, I'm listening." She thought about it for a long time. Then she began to talk, and what she said was quiet and matter-of-fact and completely devastating, the way children described horrible things when they'd had no one to tell for long enough. Not dramatically, not with tears, but with a flat accuracy that was somehow worse than screaming would have been. The place was called Brightfield Children's Home, she said. It was on the east side near the river, behind a fence. There were maybe 30 kids there. She wasn't sure exactly. She didn't see all of them all the time. Mr. Voss ran it. Mr. Voss had rules. The rules were about quiet and obedience and not asking questions and not crying where anyone could hear you. There wasn't always enough food. There was a room in the East Wing. She called it the East Wing like she'd heard adults call it that, with a lock on the outside that she'd never seen opened. She didn't know who was in there. She'd heard sounds sometimes, small sounds, at night. Ridge kept his face neutral, the way he'd kept it neutral through 3 deployments and a court-martial hearing and a dozen situations where showing what he felt would have made things worse. He kept his face neutral and his hands still and his voice level, and inside he was burning. "How long were you there?" he asked. "Since October." 4 months. A 7-year-old girl had been in that place for 4 months, and no one had come. Whatever the system was supposed to do, whatever caseworkers and oversight boards and licensing committees were supposed to catch, it hadn't caught Harlan Voss. Or it had, Ridge thought, and caught meant something different than it should. "Maisie," he said carefully, "the people who run Brightfield, if I called them right now, what would happen?" She looked at him with those dark, steady eyes. "They'd come get me," she said, "and then it would be worse." He believed her. He stood up and walked to the far end of the garage, putting his back to her, and pulled out his phone. He stood there for a moment looking at the screen. It was 5:22 in the morning. He had exactly 2 people he trusted enough to call at this hour, and the first one was Knox Mercer, who had been his president for 6 years and his friend for 12, and who answered the phone after 2 rings in a voice that was already awake because Knox Mercer was always already awake. "Yeah," Knox said. "I need you," Ridge said. "My garage, now." A pause. "How bad?" Ridge looked back at Maisie, sitting on his Harley and his cut with her feet in his wool socks, looking at him with eyes that had seen too much and trusted too little, and were currently, cautiously, considering whether he was different from the other adults. "Bad enough," Ridge said. "Bring coffee." He hung up. He pulled a mechanic's shop blanket from the shelf. Clean, it was clean, he checked, and walked back to Maisie and held it out to her. She took it without hesitation this time, which felt like something, though he couldn't have said exactly what. "Someone's coming," Ridge said. "His name is Knox. He stopped, because how did you explain Knox Mercer to a 7-year-old in a way that was honest and didn't also sound insane? "He's good," Ridge said finally. "He's one of the good ones." Maisie looked at him. "Are you?" The question sat in the air between them like a live thing. Ridge thought about Danny. He thought about a county van and a caseworker who wouldn't look him in the eye and 27 years of carrying a stone in his pocket. "I'm trying to be," he said. Knox arrived at 5:48, headlight cutting through the falling snow, the low rumble of his Road King announcing him a block before he appeared. He killed the engine in the alley and came through the side door without knocking, 6'4" and broad across the shoulders, 51 years old, with a white scar that ran from his left ear to his jaw and hands, that had built and dismantled more things than most people would see in a lifetime. He was carrying 2 coffees from the all-night place on Division and wearing his cut over a canvas jacket, and he stopped when he saw Maisie and went very still. Knox Mercer had a daughter. She was grown now, living in Boise with a husband and a baby, and Knox hadn't seen her in 3 years because of complications that neither of them talked about. But the way he looked at Maisie was not complicated. It was simple and immediate, and Ridge recognized it because it was the same thing he'd felt himself, the deep animal recognition of a child who had been failed by every adult in her orbit. Knox set the coffees on the workbench. He did not approach Maisie. He looked at Ridge. "Tell me," he said. Ridge told him. Maisie listened to Ridge tell it and didn't correct him, which meant either he had it right or she'd decided it didn't matter, and Ridge filed that away too. The girl's habit of strategic silence, her careful management of what she revealed and when. Someone had taught her that, or something had. The teaching had left marks. Knox listened without interrupting. When Ridge finished, Knox was quiet for a moment, working through something behind his eyes. Then he said, "Voss? Harlan Voss." "That's what she said." Knox's jaw shifted. "I've heard that name." Ridge looked at him. "I don't remember where," Knox said, "but I've heard it." That should have been a minor detail. It wasn't. Knox Mercer had a memory like a steel trap and a network of contacts that stretched from Portland to Seattle to a dozen other places, and if he'd heard a name, it wasn't from nowhere. Ridge felt something shift in the room's atmosphere, subtle and cold, the way the air changed before a storm system arrived. "We need Pauline," Knox said. Pauline Birch was the Iron Saints' unofficial liaison to approximately everything that the rest of the world called official channels. She was 56 years old, a former licensed clinical social worker who had left the state system after 20 years because she said, and she said it plainly to anyone who asked, that she'd watched children get hurt by the institutions designed to protect them for 2 decades, and she could not spend a third decade watching the same thing. She rode a burgundy Sportster and kept a home office full of filing cabinets and knew more about Oregon's child welfare regulatory infrastructure than most people inside that infrastructure. She was one of 3 women in the Iron Saints, which was not a club decision anyone had ever formally made. Pauline had simply shown up at a meeting with documentation about a child custody case that affected one of their members, had solved the problem in 48 hours, and had then been at the next meeting, and the meeting after that, until no one could remember a time when she hadn't been there. "It's 6 in the morning, Ridge said. "She's up," Knox said. Pauline answered on the first ring and said, without preamble, "What happened?" Knox told. There was a pause on her end. Ridge heard paper moving, a drawer opening. "Brightfield Children's Home," Pauline said. "East Side." "You know it?" "I know of it. Licensed in 2018. 1 complaint filed in 2021. Closed without investigation. I always thought the closure was..." Another pause. "Irregular. I looked at it, and then I had another case and I let it go. I shouldn't have let it go." "Can you come?" Knox asked. "Give me 20 minutes." She arrived in 18, the Sportster's engine a lower, quieter sound than Knox's Road King, and she came through the side door in her riding gear with a canvas bag over her shoulder and the expression she wore when she was already working. Focused and slightly ahead of the present moment, processing things no one else could see yet. She looked at Maisie and her expression shifted into something softer, the professional warmth of someone who'd spent 20 years learning how to put frightened children at ease. "Hi," Pauline said, to Maisie specifically. "I'm Pauline. I like your socks." Maisie looked at the socks. The ghost of something that was almost a smile moved across her face and was gone. Pauline sat down cross-legged on the floor. Not near Maisie, not at her level, just down, unthreatening, taking herself out of the standing adult configuration, and said, "You don't have to tell me anything, but if you want to talk, I'm going to listen, and nothing you say is going to make me think it's your fault, okay?" Maisie looked at her for a long moment, then she said, "There's a girl in the East Wing." The garage went quiet. Ridge and Knox exchanged a look. Pauline kept her face completely level. "What do you know about her?" Pauline asked. "Her name is Sophie," Maisie said. "She's 5. She's been in that room a long time." A pause. "Longer than me." The stone in Ridge's pocket, the one he'd carried for 27 years, got heavier. Pauline nodded slowly. "Okay," she said. "Okay, Maisie. Thank you for telling me." She looked up at Ridge over the child's head, and what was in her eyes was not the clinical professional neutrality she'd shown the girl. It was something tighter and harder and very, very serious. Ridge turned away. He picked up his coffee, which had gone cold, and drank it anyway, because his hands needed something to do. He looked at the shovel head in the center of the garage, at the old cut hanging back on the nail where Maisie had left it, at the wool sock feet of a 7-year-old girl who had walked through a Portland February night in bare feet to get somewhere she'd calculated, correctly, apparently, was safer than where she'd been. His brother had been 14. He hadn't walked anywhere. He'd had nowhere to walk to. Outside, the snow was still falling, and the alley was still empty, and the city was still dark. But somewhere across that darkness, in a building with a locked door in its east wing, a 5-year-old named Sophie was sitting in a room that no one outside these 4 walls knew about yet. And somewhere in that same building, a man named Harlan Voss was asleep, or not asleep, and either way was not afraid. Not yet. Ridge's phone buzzed. He looked at the screen. Unknown number. A text message. 3 words, no context. They're moving her. Ridge read it twice. He looked up at Knox, who was watching him from across the garage. He held up the phone. Knox read it. His face went flat and still in the way Ridge had seen exactly twice before, and both times, things had gotten very serious very quickly after. When? Knox said. Ridge looked at the text again. There was no timestamp, no additional information, nothing to tell them who had sent it, or how they knew, or what moving meant, or where Sophie was being taken, or how much time they had. He typed back, "Who is this?" The message delivered. The typing indicator appeared. Then it disappeared. Then it appeared again. And then, instead of an answer, Ridge's phone buzzed with a single image. A black and white photograph, clearly taken covertly, grainy and slightly out of focus, of a man in a parking structure reviewing documents with someone Ridge didn't recognize. But he recognized the building in the background. He'd driven past it 100 times. It was the Oregon Department of Human Services Annex on Northeast Broadway. Ridge stared at the photograph. He looked at Knox. He looked at Maisie, who had pulled the shop blanket tighter and was watching him with those dark, calculating eyes. "Knox," Ridge said quietly, "this isn't about Voss." Knox said nothing. He was waiting. "This is about whoever's above Voss," Ridge said, "and they know we have her." The space heater hummed. The country station played something about a man who'd made too many wrong turns, finding his way back to something that mattered. Outside, in the distance, faint, barely audible through the snow and the pre-dawn silence, the sound of a motorcycle engine, then 2, then 3, moving through the city like a low and deliberate warning. Someone was already watching. And somewhere across town, the clock on Sophie's locked room had just started counting down. Ridge didn't sleep. He sat in the folding chair by the workbench and watched the garage door and listened to the city outside slowly begin to remember itself. The first garbage truck of the morning somewhere on Division, a dog barking twice and stopping, the particular way Portland traffic built from nothing into something between 5 and 7 in the morning, layering sound on sound until the silence of the night was completely buried. Maisie was asleep again on the cot Pauline had assembled from a camping setup in the back of her truck, a real cot, with a sleeping bag rated for 20 degrees, and Pauline had known to bring it, which told Ridge more about Pauline's state of preparedness than anything she could have said out loud. Knox was outside in the alley, phone to his ear, pacing in short, deliberate lines the way he paced when he was managing multiple problems simultaneously and didn't want anyone to see how heavy the load was. Dex Harrow arrived at 6:40. He came in through the side door without knocking. Nobody knocked at Ridge's garage. That had stopped being a thing years ago. And he stood in the doorway for a moment, taking in the cot, the sleeping child, the 2 coffees on the workbench, and Ridge's face, which probably said more than Ridge intended. Dex was 47 and built like the combat engineer he'd been, wide through the chest and short in the neck, with forearms that looked like they belonged on someone larger, and a face that had the settled quality of a man who'd made his peace with most things, and was actively withholding that peace from the rest. He had a burn scar on his left hand that ran from the wrist to the second knuckle on his middle finger, and he had the habit, unconscious, Ridge had never seen him acknowledge it, of running his right thumb along that scar when he was thinking hard. He looked at Maisie sleeping. He looked at Ridge. He pulled the other folding chair from against the wall and sat down and said nothing, which was the right thing to do, which was why Ridge had called him. They sat in silence for a while. The country station had cycled into something instrumental, guitar and steel, nothing with words, and that was fine. That was exactly right. Text came from a burner, Ridge said finally, keeping his voice low. Knox had his guy run the number. Single use, bought with cash at a convenience store on Northeast Sandy, 3 days ago. Dex's thumb moved along the burn scar. Somebody knew 3 days ago. Somebody's been watching Brightfield for at least that long, maybe longer. Ridge picked up his coffee, found it cold, set it down. Which means somebody inside or adjacent to Brightfield knew something was about to move, and they decided to tip us instead of going to the police. Why not the police? Ridge looked at him. Dex nodded slowly. Right. The photograph. The man in the parking structure. The Oregon DHS annex in the background. The documents changing hands at an hour when documents shouldn't be changing hands. Ridge had sent it to Knox's guy, Marcus, a former Army intelligence analyst who now ran an IT security firm in Northwest Portland and did occasional work for the Brotherhood that everyone agreed not to discuss in specific terms. And Marcus had come back within 40 minutes with something that was not an identification, but was almost worse. He couldn't identify the man because the man's face had been systematically scrubbed from every database Marcus had access to, which was not a small number of databases. And a face didn't get scrubbed like that without someone who understood exactly which systems to target and had the access to target them. Whoever that man is, Ridge had told Knox at 6 in the morning, standing in the alley with snow on their shoulders, he's not just connected, he's protected. Knox had looked at the photograph for a long time. Voss is not the top of this. No. How far up does it go? Ridge hadn't answered, because the answer he was forming in his head was the kind of answer that changed what you were willing to do and what you were afraid of, and he wasn't ready to say it out loud yet. Now he looked at Dex and said, "We need to talk about what we're walking into before we walk into it." "Already in it," Dex said. "More in it than we were last night." Dex turned his head toward the sleeping girl. "She know more than she said?" "Pauline thinks so, not because she's hiding it, because she doesn't know what matters yet. She's been giving us what she has. But a 7-year-old in that situation doesn't always know which pieces are the important ones." Ridge paused. "Pauline wants to do a proper session with her this morning. Gentle, full intake. Let her lead." "That's the right call." "Knox thinks we should move her first. Different location." Dex was quiet. "Knox isn't wrong." "Knox is also reacting," Ridge said. "And reacting fast isn't the same as reacting right." The side door opened and Knox came in from the alley, shoulders dusted with snow that was already melting in the garage's warmth, phone disappearing into his jacket pocket. He looked at Ridge and Dex and pulled up a milk crate and sat on it and said, "Marcus got something." "What kind of something?" "The name." Knox's voice was level and careful, the voice he used when he was delivering information that he'd already processed and was now managing his own response to. "Harlan Voss. Before Brightfield, before Portland, before any of this, he ran a facility in Eastern Oregon, Harlan County Group Home for Boys, 1995 to 2001. The garage went very quiet. Ridge heard his own breathing. He heard the country station, steel guitar, something without words. He heard the sleeping child shift on the cot. "Ridge," Knox said, "I heard you. You know that facility." "Yes." "You want to tell me how?" Ridge stood up. He walked to the shovel head and put both hands on the handlebars and stood there with his back to the room. He wasn't hiding his face. He didn't do that. Hadn't done that since he was a teenager. He just needed something to hold on to, and the bike was what was there. The chrome was cold under his palms. He could feel every hour he'd put into this machine, every bolt and gasket and carefully stripped thread, all the late nights when his hands had needed something to rebuild, because the alternative was letting them remember things he couldn't afford to remember right now. He couldn't afford to not remember them, either. "My brother," Ridge said. "Danny. He was placed in that facility in 1997. He was 12. He stopped. Restarted. He died there in February of 1999. They said cardiac event. He was 14 years old, and he had no history of cardiac anything, and he died in a group home in the middle of winter, and the investigation took 6 weeks and concluded nothing actionable had occurred. The silence behind him was the specific silence of men who understood what that kind of official language meant when applied to a child in state care. I spent 3 years trying to reopen it, Ridge said, after I got out of the Army. I hired 2 investigators. One of them told me I was looking at the wrong people and then stopped returning my calls. The other one told me the case was clean and I needed to let it go. He paused. I didn't believe either one of them, but I ran out of money and the walls just kept being walls. And eventually, he stopped again. Eventually I came here, built this, started over. He turned around. And Harlan Voss ran that facility. Knox's face was stone. Dex's thumb was moving on the scar. I didn't know his name, Ridge said. The facility director in the records, it was a different name, Norman Gatch. I spent years on Norman Gatch. He looked at Knox. Voss was what, administrator? Program director? Deputy director, Knox said. According to the corporate filings Marcus pulled. Harlan Voss, deputy director of operations, Harlan County Group Home for Boys, 1997 to 2001. The facility closed in 2001 following what the records describe as a voluntary license surrender. Voluntary. Ridge knew what voluntary meant in that context. It meant someone had been given a choice between surrendering the license and having the license taken, and had made the calculation that surrendering looked cleaner. It meant there had been enough to force a closure, but not enough, or not enough willingness, to force a prosecution. It meant a man had hurt children, been caught doing it badly enough to lose his license, and then been allowed to resurface 7 years later in Portland with a new facility and new children and the same locked doors. "He's been doing this for 30 years, Ridge said. Nobody answered because there was no answer that helped. Maisie made a sound on the cot, not waking, just moving, some small dream causing some small disturbance, and all three men looked at her simultaneously with the same expression, which was not pity, exactly. It was something closer to the feeling you got when you understood the full scope of a thing you'd walked into without realizing and realized you could not, under any circumstances, walk back out. Pauline came in at 8 with breakfast sandwiches from the place on Hawthorne and a folder of printed materials she'd been assembling since Knox called her, and she spread the materials on the workbench while Maisie ate and watched with those careful eyes. Pauline had a way of working that involved narrating what she was doing in calm, neutral tones, not explaining herself exactly, more like making her actions visible so they couldn't be misread. And Maisie seemed to respond to it, the way she'd responded to Ridge's deliberate movements in the early morning. She finished the sandwich and pulled the shop blanket around her shoulders and watched Pauline sort papers and said, "Are you going to find Sophie?" "We're working on it," Pauline said without looking up. "She doesn't cry," Maisie said. "I thought that was because she was okay. But then I realized it was because she'd stopped." Pauline stopped sorting papers. She set them down carefully and looked at Maisie with the expression she wore when she was cataloging something for future use and hiding how much it cost her to do so. "How do you know that?" "The room is next to the laundry," Maisie said. "The vent goes through. I used to put my ear on the laundry wall at night." She looked at her hands. "At first you could hear her, then you couldn't." Ridge walked out into the alley. He stood in the cold with his hands in his jacket pockets, and the snow coming down light and steady. And he breathed through his nose, in and out, the way the VA therapist had taught him 8 years ago, when he'd attended exactly 4 sessions before deciding the process of talking about things was geometrically worse than the things themselves. In and out. The alley smelled like wet asphalt and dumpster, and the faint mechanical sweetness of oil and exhaust from the shop next door. A cat appeared at the far end, looked at him with the specific contempt that cats reserved for men standing in the cold alone, and disappeared again. A 5-year-old girl who had stopped crying. He pulled out his phone. He looked at the photograph again. The man in the parking structure, the DHS annex, the documents. He forwarded it to Pauline with a text that said, "This is what we're dealing with above Voss. Need whatever you can find on DHS oversight of Brightfield. Licensing chain. Who signed off?" Pauline's reply came back in 40 seconds. Already pulling it, he went back inside. The Brotherhood meeting happened at noon. Knox had called it. Not a formal session, not a full table, just the people who needed to be in the room, which was Ridge and Knox and Dex and Pauline and a 5th man, Garrett Reese, who was not technically a member of the Iron Saints but occupied a category that the Brotherhood had never formally defined, partly because defining it would have required acknowledging certain things about how they operated that were better left acknowledged only in practice. Garrett was 43, medium height, with the wiry tensile build of someone who moved a lot and ate when he could. He'd been a private investigator for 11 years after leaving the Portland PD, under circumstances he described as mutual dissatisfaction, and everyone else described as him filing an internal complaint about evidence tampering that had gotten exactly nowhere except sideways. He had a face that was easy to forget on purpose, the kind of face that could sit across from someone in a coffee shop for 2 hours and not register. And he had a network of sources inside and adjacent to Oregon state government that he had spent 11 careful years cultivating and never burned. Garrett had been working the photograph since 7 in the morning. He laid his laptop on the workbench and turned it so the room could see the screen. The photograph was enlarged, enhanced as much as the resolution allowed, and beside it was a second image, a public records photo, formal, the kind taken for an official directory, that showed a man who was not identical to the figure in the parking structure photograph, but shared enough structural similarities in the jaw and brow that the absence of certainty was itself a form of information. "I can't confirm this is the same man," Garrett said. "Not in court, not yet. But here's what I can tell you. This," he indicated the directory photograph, "is Commissioner Dale Arnett, Oregon Department of Human Services, Division of Child Welfare. He has held that position for 9 years. He is the single highest-ranking child welfare official in the state of Oregon, and his office is responsible for the oversight and licensing of every residential child care facility in Oregon, including Brightfield Children's Home." The garage was very quiet. "Brightfield's 2021 complaint," Pauline said. "The one that was closed without investigation. Who signed the closure?" Garrett looked at her. "Arnett's office." "Who specifically?" "That's what I'm working on. The signature is a deputy, someone named Lowry, but the authorization to close, the chain of approval, goes up." "How far up?" "I don't know yet. But here's the thing." Garrett closed the laptop. "Voss and Arnett have a history. It goes back to Eastern Oregon, to 2001, to the license surrender at the Harlan County facility. Arnett was a mid-level licensing officer at that time. He was part of the team that facilitated the voluntary surrender, which means he knew about Voss in 2001. Garrett paused to let that land. "And he licensed Brightfield in 2018, which means he knew about Voss and he licensed him anyway." Dex said, "That's not negligence." "No," Garrett said, "it's not." Knox stood up from the milk crate. He walked to the door, stood with his hand on the frame, looking at the alley outside. He stayed like that for a long moment. When he turned around, his face had the quality Ridge had seen before, the quality of a decision already made, but his voice was measured. "What we do here," Knox said, "we do right. We do it clean. We build the case, we protect the girl, and we give Garrett what he needs to take this where it needs to go. We are not going through any doors without law enforcement." He looked at Ridge specifically. "Nobody." "I know," Ridge said. "I need to hear it." "I know, Knox." Knox held his gaze for another second. "Because I also know what Voss was to your brother. And I know what it costs you to sit still on this. And I'm asking you to sit still anyway, because if we go in there without legal cover, we lose the case. The girls go back into the system, and Arnett walks. And that is not acceptable to me." He said the last 4 words with a quiet finality that made them sound like concrete being poured. "So we do this right." Ridge looked at him. He looked at Dex, who was watching him with the steady patience of a man who'd seen other men at the edge of decisions they couldn't unmake. He looked at Pauline, who was looking at her folder of papers but whose hands had gone still on the workbench. "We do it right," Ridge said. Knox nodded once, turned back to Garrett. "What do you need?" Garrett had a list. It was a long list. Financial records, licensing documentation, transfer records for the Harlan County facility's alumni, children who had passed through the system in Voss's care and whose subsequent history might form a pattern. He needed phone records if they could be obtained through legitimate channels, which Knox's attorney could potentially pursue, and he needed physical surveillance on Brightfield to establish the pattern of the transport that the anonymous text had warned about. The transport that the text said was happening tonight. "If they move Sophie tonight," Garrett said, "we need to know where she goes. Because where she goes will tell us who else is in this network. Arresting Voss is small. Following the transport is everything." Ridge said, "You want to let them take her?" "I want to follow them when they do." "She's 5 years old, Garrett. I know that. She's been in a locked room for God knows how long, and you want to use her as a—" "Ridge," Knox's voice. Flat, clean, a single word with a wall behind it. Ridge stopped. He breathed. He looked at the floor, at the concrete that had oil stains in it from 14 months of restoration work, at the marks of everything he'd taken apart and put back together in this space. He thought about what Knox had said, about doing it right, about the alternative, which was charging in and watching everything fall apart in a courtroom 6 months from now, while Arnett sat across from a defense attorney and the girls cycled into the next facility and the one after that. "Fine," Ridge said. His voice came out flatter than he intended. "Fine, but I'm on the surveillance." "You and me both," Dex said immediately. Knox looked at them both. Looked at Garrett. "Set it up." They spent the afternoon building the infrastructure of it. Garrett on his laptop at the workbench, Pauline on her phone working sources inside the child welfare network that she'd maintained even after leaving state employment, Knox managing the logistics of positioning 3 bikes near Brightfield without establishing a pattern that would be noticed. Dex drove the perimeter in his truck and came back with a hand-drawn sketch of the facility's layout, and surrounding streets and the location of every security camera he'd been able to spot from public roadways, which was more cameras than there should have been on a children's home and fewer than there would have been on a facility where security was the actual priority. The cameras at Brightfield, Dex noted, were all pointed outward, at the street, at anyone approaching, not inward, not at the building itself. They're not watching for kids to get out, Dex said, spreading the sketch on the workbench. They're watching for people to come in. Pauline looked at the sketch. Controlled access. But not institutional controlled access. That would have different camera placement. This is... She stopped. What? Knox said. This is the camera placement of someone managing discrete arrivals. Who's coming? Who's staying? Who knows? She looked up. The children aren't the commodity here. The facility is. The access is. Voss is selling something. She stopped again, and this time the silence was different, heavier. I need to make a call. She went outside. She was out there for 20 minutes. When she came back in, her face had changed in a way that Ridge recognized. It was the face of someone who had just confirmed something they'd been hoping was wrong. My contact inside DHS, Pauline said. She's been sitting on something for 6 months. She didn't know what to do with it, and she was afraid. She set her phone on the workbench. There's a list. Children who've passed through Brightfield. Specific children, specific ages, who were transferred to private placements. Not foster care. Not adoptive placements. Private placements. Off-system. The documentation exists, but it's buried under 3 layers of administrative reclassification, and the private placements all list the same attorney as the facilitating party. Who? Knox said. Someone named Carver. Lewis Carver. He's a Portland attorney who specializes in, Pauline looked at her phone, private guardianship arrangements for families of means. Ridge looked at her. Children are being sold. I can't prove that yet. But that's what you're saying. Pauline pressed her lips together. I'm saying that a pattern exists that is consistent with that conclusion, and that I hope very much I'm wrong. She looked at Garrett. We need Carver's client list. That's privileged. Not if he's participating in a criminal enterprise, which we can't prove without the client list, which we can't get without the proof. Pauline exhaled slowly through her nose. We're going to need the transport. We're going to need to follow where Sophie goes tonight and who's at the other end, and we're going to need Garrett to be in position to document everything that happens from a distance that holds up legally. The room absorbed that. Ridge looked at Maisie. She had drifted to the far end of the garage and was sitting cross-legged near the shovel head, not touching it, just near it, with the shop blanket around her shoulders and a concentration on her face that he'd started to recognize as her thinking expression. She'd been quiet for hours. Processing, maybe. Or simply resting in the fact of being somewhere that nobody had come to take her from yet. She looked up and found Ridge watching her. They'll know I'm gone by now, she said. Yes. They'll look for me. We're working on that. She was quiet for a moment, then, Mr. Voss has a car, black. The windows are dark. When kids leave, it's in that car. She paused. I never saw any of them come back. Ridge crouched down to her level. Did you ever hear where they went? Maisie looked at her hands, at the wool socks, at something in the middle distance that had nothing in it that Ridge could see. Mr. Voss called it the permanent solution, she said, when he thought nobody was listening. She looked up. I was always listening. Ridge held very still. He said it on the phone, Maisie said, last week. He said Sophie was ready for the permanent solution and that the commissioner had approved the timeline. The commissioner, Dale Arnett, the highest-ranking child welfare official in the state of Oregon, had personally approved the timeline for the transfer of a 5-year-old child from a locked room in a licensed facility to wherever Lewis Carver's clients were waiting. Ridge stood up. He turned away from Maisie so she wouldn't see his face. He walked to the far wall and put his hand flat on the cold metal of the shelving and breathed through it, in and out, the VA therapist technique, The one that had never really worked but was better than the alternative. His phone buzzed. Garrett's voice from across the garage. "Ridge!" He looked at his phone. Another text from the same burner number. This time, not a photograph. This time, just words. Voss knows about the girl. He knows she's with a biker. He knows the name Iron Saints. The transport moves at midnight. They're not just moving Sophie now. They're moving all of them. All of them. 30 children. The entire facility. Every child that Brightfield Children's Home contained, in a single midnight operation designed to scatter the evidence across a network wide enough and deep enough that no investigation would ever put it back together. Every child. Tonight. Ridge looked at Knox across the garage, and Knox had clearly seen the same text forwarded from Garrett's screen, because Knox's face had that concrete quality again, that poured and set quality, except this time underneath the concrete was something moving and dangerous. "How many vehicles does that take?" Dex said quietly. "Multiple," Garrett said. "Coordinated, prearranged. This has been planned for longer than tonight. This is an extraction protocol." He looked at his laptop. Which means somewhere somebody already knew this day was coming. They had an exit strategy built. "Arnett," Pauline said. "Arnett," Garrett agreed. The garage held all of it, the information, the weight of it, the particular specific gravity of knowing what was happening to children while the clock ran and the options narrowed. Ridge could feel the pressure of the midnight deadline in his chest like a physical thing, a tightening, the way the hours before a patrol had felt in a country far from here. The way time changed its texture when violence was approaching, and the only question was what form it would take. But this was not a patrol. These were children. And violence was the last tool on the table, not the first. "We need law enforcement," Knox said. "Tonight, before midnight." "Garrett, what do you have that's enough to get someone to move?" Garrett looked at his screen. He looked at the folder Pauline had spread on the workbench, at the photographs, at the financial documents, at the licensing chain that connected Voss to Arnett through a paper trail that was buried but not gone. He looked at all of it with the expression of a man who had spent 11 years learning the distance between what was true and what was provable. "Maybe enough," he said. "Maybe isn't. I know what maybe isn't." Garrett looked at Knox. "I have a contact at the FBI field office, agent named Torres. She's been building a case on child trafficking networks in the Pacific Northwest for 2 years, and she's clean. I'd bet my life on that. If I bring her what we have, and if what we have is enough to get her a warrant, she can move federal, which takes Arnett out of the chain of authority because you don't go through the state for a federal warrant." "How long to get Torres on the phone?" Knox asked. "I'm already texting her," Garrett said. Ridge looked at the clock on the wall above the workbench. 4:17 in the afternoon. The sun would be down by 5:30. Midnight was 7 hours and 43 minutes away, and somewhere across the city, Harlan Voss was making phone calls, and a man named Lewis Carver was preparing documents, and Commissioner Dale Arnett, who had known about Voss for 23 years and had chosen over and over and over again to know and do nothing, was in his office or his home or wherever men like that went when the machinery they'd built was doing the work they'd built it to do, and in a locked room in the east wing of a licensed children's facility, a 5-year-old named Sophie, who had stopped crying, sat in the dark and waited for whatever came next. The way children who had been waiting long enough always waited. Not with hope, because hope had become too expensive, but with the animal endurance of small things in the cold. Ridge looked at Maisie. She was watching him with those dark, steady eyes. Eyes that had already survived more than he had been able to prevent. Eyes that had done their calculating and arrived somehow at his garage in the middle of a Portland winter and found him there. "We're going to get her," Ridge said. It was not a thing he'd planned to say. It came out of somewhere below planning. Maisie looked at him for a long moment. She didn't smile. She didn't nod. She just said, "You can't promise that." And she was right. He couldn't. Because at 4:19 in the afternoon, Garrett's phone rang, and Garrett looked at the screen, and his face did something Ridge had not seen it do before. It went completely still, the way faces went still when the information arriving was large enough to temporarily suspend the processing of everything else. "Torres?" Knox said. Garrett shook his head slowly. He held up the phone so Knox could see the screen. The number was not Agent Torres. The number was a Portland Police Bureau line that Garrett, with his history and his contacts, recognized immediately. "That's internal affairs," Garrett said. Nobody spoke. "They're not calling about Voss," Garrett said. He looked at Ridge, he looked at Knox. "They're calling about us. Somebody tipped Portland PD Internal Affairs that the Iron Saints are harboring a runaway and obstructing a child welfare investigation." He set the phone on the workbench without answering it. "We've got maybe 2 hours before they have enough to send a unit to this address." 2 hours. 7 hours to midnight. 30 children. A federal agent who hadn't answered yet. And someone on the inside of their operation. Someone who knew they had Maisie, knew their name, knew this address. Who had just handed their location to the one branch of law enforcement that Arnett's network could still reach. Ridge looked at Knox. Knox looked back at him with the stone face, the concrete face, and beneath it something that Ridge had never seen in Knox Mercer in 12 years. Something that looked very much like the specific, controlled fear of a man who has just realized that the walls he thought were on one side are also on the other, and the room is smaller than he thought, and the clock is running. "We've got a leak," Knox said. "And the garage, the safe place, the leather and oil and cold coffee place, the place that had been the only sanctuary Maisie had found in 4 months of surviving, stopped feeling safe in the space between one breath and the next. The leak had a name. It took Garrett 11 minutes to find it, which was 8 minutes longer than Ridge could stand to wait, and 3 minutes less than Knox had expected. They stood around the laptop on the workbench, Knox, Ridge, Dex, Pauline, while Garrett's fingers moved across the keyboard with the controlled urgency of a man who had learned long ago that speed and accuracy were not opposites if you'd done the work long enough. Outside, the afternoon had gone gray and wet, the snow converting to rain somewhere after 4 o'clock, and the sound of it on the garage roof was a low, constant percussion that Ridge felt in his back teeth. Maisie was in the truck. Dex had moved her 20 minutes ago, quietly, without explanation, because if Portland PD Internal Affairs was coming to the garage address needed to not contain a child. The truck was parked 2 blocks east in the lot behind the Vietnamese place on Morrison, engine running for heat, with a prepaid phone loaded with 3 numbers, Knox, Ridge, and 911, in that order, and a paper bag containing the rest of the breakfast sandwiches. Maisie had gotten into the truck without protest, which was the thing about Maisie that Ridge kept returning to. Her absolute absence of argument when the situation required movement. She understood exits. She understood when to go. He hoped she was warm enough. He hoped the sandwiches were enough. He hoped the lock on the truck door was enough, and the prepaid phone was enough, and the instruction he'd given her, "If anyone knocks on that window who isn't me or Knox or Dex, you call 911 before you do anything else," was enough. He hoped a lot of things that he had no capacity to guarantee, was from standing outside the door of a room where something was happening that he couldn't stop fast enough. "There," Garrett said. The screen showed a phone record. Not the Iron Saints phones. Their operational phones were clean. Knox had built that discipline into the Brotherhood years ago. The understanding that what you said on which device mattered as much as what you said. This was a different record. The cell data from the prepaid burner that had sent Ridge the photographs and the midnight warning. The burner's signal history placed it at 6 locations over the previous 72 hours, and 5 of those locations were unremarkable. The 6th was Brightfield Children's Home. The person who'd warned them about the transport was inside Brightfield. "Staff?" Knox said. "Has to be," Garrett said. "The signal puts them on site 3 times in the last 3 days. Regular hours, roughly. Someone who works there." He scrolled. "But that's not the problem." He pulled up a second window. "The same cell tower that pinged the burner at 4:11 this afternoon, when the IA tip was called in, also pinged 2 other phones. One is unregistered, can't ID it. The other one is registered." He stopped scrolling. He looked at the screen for a moment before he turned it toward the room. "It's registered to Marcus Webb." The name sat in the air. Nobody moved. Ridge said, "That's not possible." "I'm looking at it," Garrett said. "Marcus has been with us for 7 years, Knox said. His voice was completely flat. "I know how long Marcus has been with us." Marcus Webb, the Army intelligence analyst, the IT security man in Northwest Portland who ran the cell traces and the database checks and the face identification that had told them the man in the parking structure photograph was scrubbed from every accessible database. who had run the burner number at 5 in the morning and come back with the convenience store on Northeast Sandy, who had been the first person outside this garage to know that Ridge had a child and a photograph and a name. Dex said, "He could have been compromised, blackmailed, could be—" "It doesn't matter what it is," Knox said. "Right now it doesn't matter. What matters is what he's told them and who he's told it to." "He told them everything," Ridge said. The certainty of it arrived fully formed, not a conclusion he'd reasoned to, but a thing he simply knew the way he knew certain things in the field, the way the body registered danger before the mind had language for it. He's been telling them from the beginning, the convenience store, the burner, the photograph. If he ran those traces for us, he ran them for them too. He told Arnett's people what we had within an hour of us having it. Pauline said, "Which means Arnett has had all day to prepare." The rain on the roof. The country station, still playing, still instrumental. Knox turned away from the laptop and walked to the garage door and stood with his arms crossed and his back to the room, and Ridge watched the back of his head and the set of his shoulders and understood that Knox Mercer was doing the thing he did when the situation required him to feel something enormous and act on something precise, which was hold both simultaneously and let neither one contaminate the other. It was the discipline that made him president. It was also, Ridge suspected, the discipline that had cost him his daughter. "Torres," Knox said without turning around. "Garrett, did Torres answer?" "Not yet." "Keep trying." He turned around. "We need to move everything. This location is burned. The truck with Maisie moves first, different direction, somewhere Marcus doesn't know about." He looked at Dex. "You have the West Side place." Dex nodded. A storage unit he rented under a business name, used for parts overflow, that he'd never mentioned in connection with the Brotherhood to anyone outside the Core Four. Knox had known about it. Marcus had not. "Take her there," Knox said. "Take Pauline. I want Pauline with her." He looked at Pauline, who was already putting her folder in her bag. "Can you keep working from there?" "I can work from anywhere," Pauline said. "Good. Go. Now." He looked at Ridge. "You're with me." "Where are we going?" Knox picked up his helmet from the workbench. He looked at Ridge with an expression that was not complicated at all. It was the expression of a man who had been protecting people for long enough to know that the moment you stopped moving forward was the moment you lost. "We're going to find Marcus," he said, "and we're going to find out exactly what he gave them and when. And then we're going to figure out what we can still salvage before midnight." Ridge picked up his own helmet. He didn't say anything about Danny, about the stone in his pocket, about the fact that Marcus Webb had been one of 4 people he'd told about Harlan Voss and the Harlan County facility when they'd first discovered the connection that morning. He didn't say any of that. He put his helmet on and followed Knox out into the rain. Marcus Webb's office was on Northwest Thurman, 3rd floor of a converted Victorian that housed 3 small tech companies and a therapist who specialized in corporate burnout. It was the kind of building that looked like money trying not to look like money. Exposed brick, original hardwood, security cameras that were expensive enough to be subtle. Garrett had called ahead, which was to say he had sent a text to Marcus from his own phone that said, "Only need you on something urgent. Are you in?" And Marcus had replied, "Yeah, come up." Because of course Marcus had replied that way, because Marcus had been managing them for long enough to know that acting normal was the only play left. The bikes were loud in the rain, Harley engines doing what they always did in wet, cold air, running rough and deep and unavoidably present, the sound of men arriving who could not be mistaken for anything other than what they were. Ridge didn't care. He was past caring about subtlety. He parked on the street and went up the stairs behind Knox, and felt his heart rate sitting at a number that was too high for a man climbing stairs, and not high enough for a man about to do something irreversible, and he worked on keeping it there, in that controlled space between calm and fury. Knox knocked on the office door with 3 knocks. Not heavy, just deliberate, the kind of knock that carries information about the person behind it. Marcus opened it. He was 41, medium build, the kind of man who processed everything through an expression of mild, amiable competence that Ridge had always read as genuine. He had a beard that was maintained at a specific length, wire-framed glasses, a flannel shirt over a thermal. He looked like someone's favorite uncle. He looked completely unsurprised to see them. That was the tell. A man who'd gotten a text saying, "Need you on something urgent," and then heard 2 Harleys park on the street, and had Knox Mercer and Ridge Callow show up at his door. That man, if he was innocent, would show something. Curiosity, concern. The specific micro-expressions of someone trying to read a situation that didn't fully make sense yet. Marcus showed none of those things. He held the door open and stepped back and said, "Come in." And the flatness of it was the answer to every question Ridge still had. The office was neat. Multiple screens on a standing desk, a server rack against one wall, filing cabinets, the low hum of cooling systems doing their work. One window looking out at Thurman, rain on the glass, the street below wet and reflecting yellow from the streetlights. Knox walked in and stood in the center of the room and didn't sit down and didn't take off his jacket. Ridge closed the door behind them and put his back against it, which was not a thing he'd planned but was a thing his body had decided. "You've been talking to Arnett," Knox said. Marcus took off his glasses. He cleaned them on his flannel. He put them back on. He looked at Knox with the expression of a man who had already rehearsed this moment and was now executing the rehearsal. "Knox, don't," Knox said quietly. "I've known you 7 years. You owe me better than a rehearsed opener." Marcus stopped. His jaw moved. He looked at the floor for a moment and then back up, and his face changed. Not into guilt, exactly, but into something more complex. The expression of a man who had convinced himself that what he'd done had reasons. And those reasons were not simple. And he needed the person across from him to understand that before judgment arrived. "Sit down," Knox said. Marcus sat. Knox did not. "How long?" Knox said. Marcus looked at his hands on the desk. 14 months. 14 months. Ridge did the math without wanting to. 14 months ago was before Maisie, before Voss, before any of this specific chain of events. 14 months ago was deep in the ordinary operation of the Iron Saints, in the routine case-by-case work that the Brotherhood did, the quiet interventions and the custody disputes, and the occasions where Garrett needed a cell trace or a background check, and Marcus was the man who ran it. 14 months of everything they'd done passing through hands that were also connected to the other side. "What did they have on you?" Knox asked. Marcus said nothing. "Marcus." "My son," Marcus said. The 2 words came out like something dropped from a height. "He's 17. He had a situation 2 years ago, a girl, a misunderstanding, but the documentation existed, and they found it, and they told me that documentation could either stay buried or it could—" He stopped. "He's 17. He's going to college in September. He's a good kid." Ridge looked at the window, at the rain on the glass, at the yellow reflection of the streetlight on the wet asphalt below. He thought about his mother, about the particular specific way adults made choices to protect the people they loved at the cost of other people's children, and how those choices compounded and stacked until the weight of them crushed someone who had no one making that calculation in their favor. He thought about Danny. "What did you give them?" Knox said. "Everything you brought to me." Marcus's voice had gone small. Not quiet, small, the specific diminishment of a man saying things he'd been carrying alone. "The cell trace this morning, the photograph. I confirmed your location at Ridge's garage. I told them you had the girl." He paused. "I didn't know about the children at Brightfield. I didn't know what they were doing. I knew Arnett was connected to Voss, and I knew they wanted to find out how much you knew, and I—" He stopped again. "I told myself it was information management, that I wasn't hurting anyone, that you'd figure it out and it would be fine." 30 children, Ridge said. His voice was very even. "They're moving 30 children tonight to scatter the evidence. That's what your information management enabled." Marcus flinched. "Is Torres real?" Garrett had given them the name before they'd left. "Does Torres actually exist? Did Arnett's people create her?" Marcus looked up sharply. "What?" "No. Torres is real. She's FBI. She's been building the trafficking case. I didn't touch Torres. I don't have access to federal systems, and I wouldn't—" He stopped. Something shifted in his face. "They know about Torres, though, Arnett's people. They've known about her investigation for months. They've been feeding her just enough to keep her occupied without giving her anything actionable." Knox turned and looked at Ridge. The federal investigation that was supposed to be their clean option, the path that didn't require anyone to go through a door without legal cover, had been managed from the inside. Torres had been working a maze that Arnett's network had built around her, which meant even if Garrett reached her tonight, Even if she moved on what they had, there was a layer underneath her access that she didn't know about. A pre-built defense that would collapse the case from the inside the moment it got inside far enough to matter. Unless, Ridge said slowly. Knox looked at him. Unless Torres has something they don't know about, Ridge said. Something that came in from outside their network. Something that didn't go through Marcus. He looked at Marcus. Maisie. Does Arnett know specifically what Maisie said? About the commissioner approving Sophie's timeline? About Sophie specifically? Marcus's expression changed. No. I gave them the location. I told them you had a child from Brightfield. I didn't. When she spoke about that, I wasn't on the phone. I wasn't monitoring. I gave them audio on the general conversations, but the exchange with the girl was… He stopped. I don't know how much they got. You put audio on my garage, Ridge said. The words landed. Marcus looked at him. He didn't deny it. Ridge felt something in his chest that he hadn't felt in years. A very specific variety of betrayal, the kind that arrived not with heat, but with cold. The cold of something fundamental proving to be untrue. 7 years. He had brought Marcus into the Brotherhood's operations 7 years ago. He had vouched for him. He had handed Knox his recommendation with the certainty of a man who believed he understood people well enough to know when they were genuine. He put his hands in his pockets and looked at the rain on the window and did not trust himself to speak for approximately 10 seconds. Knox said, "Everything she said this morning, before 6 a.m. Was that captured?" Marcus was quiet. Marcus. The device had a 15-minute boot delay after installation. It activated at 5:55 a.m. He paused. Whatever she said before that, they don't have. Ridge ran it back. Maisie had mentioned Sophie by name at 8 o'clock during Pauline's session. She'd mentioned the East Wing, the locked room, the 5-year-old who had stopped crying. She had mentioned at 8:40 the specific phrase Harlan Voss had used on the phone, the permanent solution, and she had mentioned the commissioner's name in connection with the timeline. That was well after 5:55. All of it captured, all of it known by Arnett before noon. Arnett had known all day that they knew, had known that they had a direct witness who had heard his name connected to Sophie's transfer, had spent the entire afternoon not trying to stop them, but managing them. The IA tip designed not to arrest them, but to pressure them, to make them move Maisie away from the garage and into transit where she'd be more vulnerable, to scatter them before midnight so that when the transport happened, there would be no unified response. "He's not afraid of us," Ridge said. "He's hurting us." Knox looked at him. The IA tip, the leak through Marcus, all of it. It's not suppression, it's management. He knows what we have. He knows it's not enough for Torres without Maisie's testimony, and he knows if he can get Maisie separated from legal counsel and the Brotherhood before midnight, if he can make CPS pick her up as a runaway before Garrett builds enough to get a warrant, then he has no direct witness and the transport proceeds and everything scatters. Ridge turned away from the window and looked at Knox with the full weight of what he'd just assembled. We have maybe 4 hours before someone legally compelled to return Maisie to the state system finds out where Dex took her. Knox was already moving. He pulled out his phone and called Dex. 2 rings, then Dex's voice, low and careful. "Yeah." "How's the package?" "Settled. Pauline's working." "Listen to me. We have a potential CPS contact risk in the next few hours. Anyone who can legally compel the return of the girl needs to believe she's still in motion and hasn't been located. You understand?" A pause. "I understand. Don't move her again unless I call you, but be ready to move her if I do. Keep Pauline's phone away from any networks Marcus had access to." Another pause. "Knox. Is it Marcus?" "Yes." The silence on Dex's end was very short and very complete. "Okay," he said finally. "We're ready." Knox hung up. He looked at Marcus. He looked at him for a long time without expression, the way Knox looked at things he was assessing for structural integrity, whether they still held, whether they could still be used, whether the damage was catastrophic or merely severe. "You're going to help us," Knox said. Marcus looked up. "Not because I'm giving you a choice," Knox said. "Because you've been carrying your son for 14 months, and these people have been using that carry to hurt children. And if you have any part of yourself left that knows what that means, you're going to help us fix what you broke tonight." He let that sit. "And then we're done. You understand?" We are done. Marcus looked at his hands on the desk. His shoulders moved. Not a shrug, something smaller, the specific collapse of a man releasing a posture he'd been holding so long, he'd forgotten it wasn't natural. He said, "What do you need?" They needed his access. His network turned around. He had spent 14 months feeding information to Arnett's people through channels he had built and maintained, which meant he knew the architecture of how Arnett's information network received and processed data. He knew which numbers got flagged, which channels were monitored, which lines were secure. He knew, specifically, the communication protocol between Voss and the transport coordinator, a logistics person he'd intercepted twice in message chains and had never flagged for Knox, had buried instead. The transport coordinator, Garrett said, when Marcus gave them the name. He was on the phone now, laptop in his backpack, having arrived at Marcus's office 15 minutes after Knox and Ridge because he'd been finishing a call. That's the key. Not Voss. Voss is operational. He doesn't know the destination. The coordinator knows the destination. If Marcus can get me the coordinator's communication line, I can trace the destination before the transport moves. Then what? Ridge said. Then I have something for Torres that didn't come through any channel Arnett controls. Something clean. Something his defense can't claim was planted or compromised. Ridge said, "And if Torres can't move in time?" Garrett looked at him. "Then we follow the transport and I document everything from outside, and we hand Torres a location and not just a destination. And if the transport splits, 30 children, multiple vehicles, then we follow as many as we can and we document as many as we can, and we accept that tonight isn't going to be clean," Garrett said, and his voice was the voice of a man who had spent 11 years accepting that things weren't clean and doing the work anyway. But Ridge, the children, Maisie's testimony, Arnett's name on Sophie's timeline, that doesn't go away. Even if tonight is partial, even if some of them scatter, the testimony holds. The legal case holds. The network comes down even if not everyone is caught tonight. "Sophie," Ridge said. Garrett met his eyes. "Sophie doesn't scatter," Ridge said. "Sophie is the one they moved first, the one they've been preparing the longest, the one the commissioner personally signed off on. Sophie is going to the highest value destination in the network, which means Sophie's transport is the one I'm following personally, regardless of what else happens tonight." Knox said, "Ridge." "I know," Ridge said. "I know what you're going to say. You don't go in. I follow. I document. I call it in, and I wait for Torres to move." He looked at Knox and held the look. "But I am not watching a black car take a 5-year-old to wherever Lewis Carver's clients are and calling it someone else's problem." Knox held the look for 3 full seconds. Then he said, "You ride with me. Not alone." "Fine. And when Torres moves, we pull back, all the way back. We give her the documentation and we pull back and we let the federal process work." "Fine. Say it like you mean it." Ridge looked at him. "I mean it, Knox. I want this to hold in court. I want Arnett to sit in a federal courtroom and have no exits. I mean it." Knox held the look for another 2 seconds. Then he nodded once, which was the Knox-Mercer equivalent of a signed contract. Marcus worked for 40 minutes with Garrett at his shoulder, pulling the transport coordinator's communication line from the chain of intercepted messages he'd been burying for months, and what emerged from that pull was not just a logistics contact. It was a thread, and when Garrett pulled the thread, it unraveled into something that made the room go quiet, in the specific way rooms went quiet when the full scope of a thing became visible all at once. The transport coordinator's name was Ellen Voss, Harlan Voss's sister. She operated a private transportation company out of Eugene that had state contracts for medical transport and school district logistics. A company that had been awarded those contracts through a procurement process that, when Marcus ran the chain at Garrett's direction, connected back to Lewis Carver's office as the facilitating legal entity. She had been moving children for her brother's network for 9 years. She had state authorization to operate transport vehicles carrying minors in Oregon, Washington, and Idaho. She knew every checkpoint, every reporting requirement, every gap in the oversight system that she and her brother and Dale Arnett had spent years mapping and exploiting. And she had tonight's transport manifest open on a tablet in an office in Eugene, 3 hours away, while her vehicles were already en route to Portland. "How many vehicles?" Knox said. "4. Marcus said, reading from the intercepted data. Leaving Brightfield at staggered intervals beginning at 11:30 p.m. Different routes. 3 of them go to intermediate locations. Foster homes, group homes, all of them connected to Carver's network. All of them places where children can sit legally for weeks before the next move. The 4th vehicle. He stopped. He looked at the screen. He looked at Knox. The 4th vehicle is direct transport. It's going to a private airfield outside Salem. There's a flight plan filed for a private aircraft departing at 2 a.m. The room was very quiet. An airfield. A private flight plan. 2 in the morning. Sophie was being taken out of the state. Can you get me the flight plan? Garrett said. I already have it. Marcus turned the screen. The destination is a private estate outside Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. The registered owner of the property is a holding company, but the holding company's beneficial ownership. He stopped. He took off his glasses again and rubbed his face with both hands in the gesture of a man arriving at the end of something. The beneficial owner is a man named Gerald Thorne. Garrett went completely still. Ridge didn't know the name. Knox didn't either, from the look on his face. But Garrett did. Garrett's stillness was the stillness of recognition, not discovery. The stillness of a man who had just seen a piece of a puzzle he'd been holding for a long time lock into a picture he hadn't seen before and didn't like. Who is Thorne? Knox said. Garrett looked at his laptop. He pulled up something, a cached file, something he'd been carrying, and turned the screen. It was a photograph, an event photograph, the kind taken at charity galas and foundation dinners, a room full of people in formal wear at tables. Garrett zoomed in on a face in the background. He zoomed in again. The face was Dale Arnett, sitting next to a man whose name, according to the event caption in the photograph's metadata, was Gerald Thorne, Portland Children's Fund Annual Dinner, 2019. Thorne is old money, Garrett said. Oregon timber money. He sits on 3 foundation boards, including 2 that fund child welfare programs. He's untouchable. He's been untouchable for 30 years because people like him are always untouchable until they're not. He looked at Knox. He's not a buyer. He's the top of the network. He's been running it from behind Arnett and Carver and Voss this entire time. The facility, the transfers, the private placements, it all flows to Thorne. Ridge looked at the photograph on Garrett's screen. At Dale Arnett in formal wear at a charity dinner, smiling at a camera, seated next to the man who was the reason 30 children were being loaded into vans at midnight, and a 5-year-old was scheduled for a private flight to Idaho in less than 9 hours. He thought about the stone in his pocket. He thought about Danny in 1999 and the Harlan County group home and the official cause of death that was a cardiac event, and the investigation that concluded nothing actionable had occurred. He thought about Harlan Voss, who had been deputy director of that facility. He thought about the word permanent, the way Maisie had said Voss used it on the phone, and about what permanent meant when applied to a child being placed with a man like Gerald Thorne in a private estate outside Coeur d'Alene. He looked at Knox. Knox was already looking at him, and Knox's face, the concrete face, the poured and set face, had something in it that Ridge had not seen there in 12 years of knowing Knox Mercer. Not fear. Something adjacent to fear, something that fear looked like, when it was processed through 30 years of discipline and came out the other side as absolute, immovable resolve. Call Torres, Knox said to Garrett. Right now. Don't stop calling until she answers. He looked at Ridge. We ride at 10. We position near Brightfield and we wait for the 4th vehicle, the direct transport. He picked up his helmet. And Ridge. I know, Ridge said. No, listen to me. Knox put one hand on his shoulder briefly, the way Knox touched people, rarely, precisely, when it meant something. Danny is not in that van. Sophie is in that van. You go in there tonight with Danny, you lose Sophie. You understand the difference? The rain on the roof, the hum of Marcus's servers, the faint sound of Thurman Street through the window, wet tires on wet asphalt, the ordinary machinery of a city that didn't know what was moving through it tonight. Ridge looked at his president, his friend, the man who had handed him a brotherhood when he had nothing else to belong to, the man who had never once in 12 years asked him to be anything other than what he was, and who was asking him now to be the hardest possible version of that. He said, I understand. He believed it when he said it. What he didn't know yet, what none of them knew, standing in Marcus Webb's office on Northwest Thurman at 8:30 in the evening, with 3.5 hours until Brightfield's first transport vehicle rolled, was that Garrett's phone was going to ring in 11 minutes, and it was going to be Agent Torres. And what Torres was going to say was going to change every calculation they'd made, was going to strip away every contingency and every careful legal strategy and every version of tonight in which the Iron Saint stood at a legal distance and watched the federal process do its work, and was going to leave Ridge Callow standing at the center of something with no cover, no distance, and no time left for careful. Torres answered on the 17th call. She said, "I know who you are. I know about the girl. I've been trying to reach you for 6 hours through channels I trust, which are 3 people, and all 3 of them told me you'd gone dark." Her voice was steady and clipped, the voice of someone running on insufficient sleep and sufficient urgency. "I need you to listen to me very carefully. My investigation, my official investigation, has been infiltrated. I've known for 2 months. I've been running a parallel track that nobody in my office knows about, nobody in state law enforcement knows about, and it has to stay that way until tonight." A pause. Very short. "I have enough for warrants on Voss and Arnett. I have had enough for 3 weeks. I've been waiting for Thorne, because without Thorne, the network reconstitutes in 18 months, and we do this again with different names." Her voice dropped slightly. "Gerald Thorne is going to be at that airfield in Salem tonight. He comes personally for the significant transfers. He's been doing it for 15 years and nobody has ever been in position to document it. Tonight, I need someone in position." Garrett looked at Knox. Knox looked at Ridge. Torres said, "I can't send federal agents to that airfield without tipping the infiltration in my office. I can surveil, and I can intercept, and I can make the arrest. But I need documentation from an independent source that puts Thorne at the airfield at the time of the transfer, and I need that documentation to come from someone who can testify that they were there as a civilian observer, not as law enforcement." Another pause. "I need the Iron Saints at that airfield at 1:45 a.m. I need cameras. I need Ridge Callow specifically, because his testimony about his brother and the Harlan County facility connects Voss to a pattern that goes back 26 years. And that pattern is what makes this case federal rather than state. And federal rather than state is the only way Thorne doesn't walk." Ridge Callow. By name. Torres had known his name before Garrett said it. "How long have you been watching us?" Knox said. "Long enough," Torres said. "The girl, Maisie, is she safe?" "Yes." "Keep her safe until I can get a protective order in place." "That's my first move tonight, before the airfield. The protective order covers the girl and any child we can identify from the facility. It goes in at 11 p.m. through a federal judge I trust, which means state CPS has no authority to compel her return after that." A pause. "You have 3 hours to get to Salem? Are you in?" The question was for Knox. Knox looked at Ridge. Ridge looked at the rain on the window, at the reflection of the street below, yellow and wet, the ordinary world doing its ordinary thing 3 floors down. While up here, the entire architecture of 30 children's futures rested on what one man said in the next 5 seconds. He thought about Knox's words. "Danny is not in that van. Sophie is in that van." He thought about a 5-year-old who had stopped crying. He thought about standing on the outside of every room where something was happening that he couldn't stop fast enough, and the specific particular cost of being the kind of man who kept standing there anyway, who kept showing up, who refused to decide the distance was far enough to be an excuse. "We're in," Ridge said. And the room moved, and the night moved, and somewhere south of Portland, a private airfield sat dark in the rain with its lights off and its runway cold, waiting for a flight plan that listed no passengers by name, because the people who arranged these things had learned long ago that the most effective way to hide a child was to make her invisible in the paperwork that was supposed to protect her. Ridge Callow put on his helmet and walked out into the rain and started his Harley, and the engine turned over with the sound that engines make when they have been taken apart and put back together by hands that needed something real to hold on to, and he pulled out onto Thurman Street and pointed south, and the night closed around him like a fist. The rain followed them south. It came off the Coast Range in sheets, moving east across the Willamette Valley in waves that the headlights caught and turned into walls of white before the road reappeared on the other side. Ridge rode with Knox 3 bike lengths back and slightly left, the formation they'd held on 100 night runs, the positioning that let each of them see what the other couldn't from straight behind. The interstate was thin at this hour. A few semis running freight, a night shift worker in a Civic doing exactly the speed limit, the occasional set of taillights that appeared and then was gone. The kind of traffic that existed in the negative space of a city's sleep cycle. The commerce of people who moved in the dark because the dark was when things needed moving. Ridge had his phone mounted on the handlebar bracket, screen dimmed to the lowest visible setting. The map Torres had sent showing the airfield 12 miles southeast of Salem. She'd sent it through Garrett via a protocol that Marcus, newly conscripted and comprehensively motivated, had confirmed was outside any channel Arnett's people were monitoring. Whether Marcus's assessment was reliable at this point was a question Ridge had filed in the category of things he had to accept on insufficient evidence because the alternative was paralysis, and paralysis was not available tonight. The clock on the phone read 10:47. 1 hour and 58 minutes to the flight plan's departure window. He thought about Maisie and Dex's storage unit on the west side, with Pauline and a sleeping bag and a prepaid phone, and the quiet competence of two people who understood that keeping a child safe sometimes looked like keeping a child still. He thought about the protective order Torres had filed at 11 p.m. through the federal judge she trusted, the order that created a legal perimeter around Maisie that state CPS could not cross. He thought about the word trust and how many times tonight that word had been the only infrastructure between them and total collapse, and how many times the infrastructure had held by less margin than he'd have liked. He rolled the throttle and felt the engine respond the way the engine always responded, immediately, completely, without negotiation. And he let that steadiness travel up through the handlebars into his palms and into his arms and into the center of his chest where the stone had been sitting for 27 years. Knox's brake light flashed twice. Their signal for attention. Ridge scanned the road ahead. A vehicle pulled to the shoulder 300 yards out, dark, no emergency lights, positioned at an angle that was not the angle of a car with a mechanical problem. It was the angle of a car that had stopped in order to observe traffic passing in a particular direction. Ridge noted the make, black SUV, Oregon plates, and let his eyes go soft focus the way he'd been taught to do at range, peripheral awareness over direct attention. A figure in the driver's seat, not moving, watching. He and Knox passed without slowing. In his mirror, the SUV pulled back onto the road. Knox's voice came through the earpiece Garrett had given them both at Marcus's office. A short-range encrypted channel, 2-mile radius, untraceable. We've got a tail. I see it. Arnett? Or Thorne's people? Same difference. Torres needs to know. Ridge keyed the relay that would send a one-word alert to Garrett, who was 40 minutes behind them in a rental car with his camera equipment and enough documentation to support a federal arrest and the particular look of a man who had been waiting 11 years for a night exactly like this one. The relay went through. Garrett's acknowledgement came back in 4 seconds, a single click on the channel. Knox said, "We can't lead them to the airfield." "I know. We need to split them off." "I know, Knox." A pause, the sound of rain and engine and wet asphalt under tires. Then Knox said, with the specific tone he used when he was handing Ridge a decision that was Ridge's to make, "Your call." Ridge looked in the mirror. The SUV was maintaining distance, professional distance, 200 yards, close enough to track and far enough to deny. Whoever was driving knew surveillance, which meant they were serious and they were resourced, and they were almost certainly in communication with someone who was either already at the airfield or making decisions about the airfield based on what was reported from this highway. If they led a tail to Torres's position, they burned the entire operation. If they stopped to confront the tail, they burned time they didn't have. If they split, one bike to peel off and pull the tail while the other continued to the airfield, they arrived at the most dangerous point of the night with half their visible presence, and Ridge would be alone. He thought about Knox's hand on his shoulder at Marcus's office. Danny is not in that van. "Go straight," Ridge said. "I'll pull them." "Ridge, I'll meet you there. Give me 12 minutes. He didn't wait for Knox to answer. He touched the brake and dropped back, letting Knox's taillight move ahead, watching the distance between them grow. And then he cut right across the lane, hit the exit ramp at Brookings Road, and accelerated hard into the dark of the off-ramp. The SUV followed. He'd known it would. He was the irregular one, the bike that had moved unexpectedly, the variable in the surveillance pattern that required resolution. He came off the ramp onto Brookings, two-lane county road running west into farmland and dark, and he ran it at speed, rain hammering the visor, the road surface slick and unpredictable, the kind of riding that required complete attention and no margin for the kind of interior noise that had been his constant companion for 27 years. There was nothing back here except the road and the rain and the headlight behind him and the engine beneath him, and for approximately 90 seconds, Ridge Callow was purely, entirely present, which was the closest thing to peace he knew how to find. He took 3 turns in 4 minutes, choosing roads that narrowed, that curved, that put trees between himself and the following headlight. He ran without lights for 40 seconds on a straight stretch, which was genuinely dangerous and completely effective. And when he came back on the lights, he was alone on the road and the following headlight was gone. He waited 30 seconds. Nothing. He turned north, looped back to the interstate through a farm access road that ran parallel to the highway, and rejoined southbound traffic at the next on-ramp. His heart rate was in the zone where everything was slightly more detailed than normal, colors slightly sharper, the sound of the engine slightly more present. He'd run at this rate for hours in the field. He could run at this rate tonight. Knox's voice. Clear? Clear, 8 minutes out. Copy. I'm parked at the coordinates Torres gave us. She's not here yet. Is the airfield active? A pause. There are lights on the south end, ground crew, and Ridge. There's a vehicle in the south lot, black. Oregon plates. The transport. Sophie was already there. Ridge rolled the throttle to its limit, and the shovelhead answered like it had been waiting for exactly this. The restored engine running at a pitch that was somewhere between mechanical and alive. The sound of 14 months of hands-on work expressing itself at full capacity on a rain-soaked Oregon highway at 11:15 at night. And he didn't think about the speed or the rain or the road surface. He thought about a 5-year-old in the back of a black vehicle in a dark parking lot waiting for a flight to Idaho, and he rode. The airfield appeared as a cluster of low lights in flat farmland, the kind of private facility that existed in the negative space of Oregon's aviation infrastructure. Too small to be regulated closely, too private to be publicly documented, serviced by a county road that wasn't on most navigation systems, and didn't need to be because the people who used it knew where it was. A chain-link fence ran the perimeter, the gate standing open, no guard in the booth. The lights Torres had mentioned were on the south end, a hangar with its door partially open, interior light spilling onto the wet tarmac, and the silhouette of a small aircraft visible inside. Ridge killed his headlight 200 yards from the gate and rode in on engine sound and muscle memory and the ambient light from the hangar, parking the bike behind a cluster of equipment trailers on the east side of the lot that gave him a line of sight to the south lot without putting him in the open. Knox's Road King was already there, dark. Knox dismounted and crouched between the trailers with his phone in his hand. Ridge came off the bike and crouched beside him. They looked at each other in the dark without speaking for 1 second. The specific communication of 2 men who had done dangerous things in each other's company long enough to not need language for the basic operating agreement. Then Ridge looked at the south lot. The black vehicle was an Escalade, and it was not alone. There were 2 other cars, a silver sedan and a late-model pickup, both dark, both positioned facing the hangar. 3 vehicles. Multiple people. The Escalade's rear windows were tinted past legal limit. Someone in that vehicle, or someone who had been in that vehicle, was the reason Ridge had ridden 90 miles in the rain on 48 hours without sleep. Torres? Ridge said, barely voiced. 5 minutes out, Knox said. She texted Garrett. Federal units on 2 roads. She's running quiet approach. Does she need us to do anything? She needs us to stay put and document. Ridge looked at the hangar. A man had appeared in the partially open door. Security, by the look of him. The particular stance of someone positioned to observe rather than work. He scanned the lot in a single slow arc and then looked back into the hangar. He hadn't seen them. Ridge looked at the Escalade. He looked at it for 15 seconds. He thought about the flight plan, 2 a.m. departure. It was 11:31 p.m. 2.5 hours. Torres had 5 minutes, maybe 10, and federal units arriving on 2 roads. The math was fine. The math held. The child in that vehicle was not going anywhere in the next 10 minutes, and in 10 minutes, Torres would be in position with federal authority and documentation support from Garrett's cameras and Ridge's testimony. And it would hold, and it would be clean, and it would be the version that put Thorne in a federal courtroom with no exits. He knew all of that. He also knew that a 5-year-old who had stopped crying was in the back of that Escalade. "Ridge," Knox said quietly, "I'm here. I can hear you thinking. I'm staying put." Knox looked at him. "Say it like you mean it." Ridge looked at the Escalade. "I mean it." He pulled out the compact camera Garrett had given him and began documenting the vehicles, the plate numbers, the hangar, the guard, the aircraft silhouette. His hands were steady. His breathing was controlled. He did the work he was here to do, and he did not move from behind the equipment trailers. And he held the line Knox had asked him to hold, and that Torres needed him to hold, and that he had promised, in Marcus's office in the rain, that he would hold. 3 minutes passed. Then the hangar door opened fully. A man walked out. He was in his 60s, broad, white-haired, wearing a waxed canvas field coat that probably cost more than most people's car payments. And he walked with the unhurried confidence of someone who had never once in his life been required to move at anyone else's pace. 2 men flanked him, close enough to be security, calibrated enough to look like associates. He walked to the Escalade and stopped beside the rear passenger door and looked at his watch. Ridge photographed all of it. Gerald Thorne, at the airfield, at 11:34 p.m., in possession of a transport vehicle containing a child scheduled for private transfer. "That's him," Knox said, barely a breath. "Garrett's getting this?" Ridge clicked the relay. Garrett's acknowledgement came back immediately. He was in position, east perimeter, camera running. Then Thorne said something to one of his associates, and the associate opened the Escalade's rear door. Ridge went very still. The associate leaned into the vehicle. He straightened. He was carrying something, a child, a small child, wrapped in a blanket. The child's head against the associate's shoulder with the boneless, loose weight of someone deeply asleep or sedated, and Ridge felt every muscle in his body contract simultaneously into a single point of absolute tension. Sedated. They had sedated a 5-year-old for transport. He heard Knox make a sound beside him. Not a word, just a sound. The kind that escapes before the discipline catches it. "Torres," Ridge said into the earpiece. "Where's Torres?" Garrett's voice on the channel. 2 minutes. She's coming in from the North Road. Ridge, 2 minutes. The associate was walking toward the hangar with Sophie. Thorne was following. 2 minutes. Ridge looked at the distance between the equipment trailers and the hangar entrance. 60 yards. Open tarmac. Wet. Lit by the hangar interior. 1 guard at the door. 2 associates with Thorne. 60 yards of open ground in 2 minutes before a federal intervention that would be clean and legal and would hold in court. He looked at Knox. Knox was looking at the hangar door. Knox's face had the concrete quality, the poured and set quality, and underneath it something Ridge had never seen in 12 years was moving again. The same thing that had moved there at Marcus's office. The thing that looked like fear processed through 30 years of discipline. Knox said, 2 minutes. I know. Ridge. I know, Knox. The guard at the hangar door moved to let Thorne's group through. He held the door. He looked out at the lot in another slow arc. Ridge and Knox were motionless behind the trailers, below his sightline, in the dark. The guard went inside. The hangar door began to close. Ridge stood up. Knox grabbed his arm. Not hard, not a restraint, just contact, the specific weight of one man's hand on another man's arm in the dark, carrying everything that couldn't be said in the time available. 2 minutes, Knox said one more time, and his voice was not commanding and it was not pleading. It was simply the voice of a man who understood exactly what was happening and was asking one last time for the version of events that didn't cost everything. Ridge looked at Knox's hand on his arm. He looked at Knox's face. He thought about all the versions of this moment that he'd been carrying since 1999, all the rooms he'd been outside of, all the doors he hadn't been able to get through in time, all the iterations of standing at the edge of something and being held back by the right reasons while the wrong things happened on the other side. He thought about Maisie's voice in the garage at 5 in the morning. Please don't send me back. The calculating stillness of her eyes, the specific intelligence of a child who had survived by learning to read exits. The way she'd sat near the shovel head like it was a landmark, something fixed in a world that had given her no fixed things. He thought about Sophie, who had stopped crying. He removed Knox's hand from his arm, carefully. Not with force, but with finality. "I'll be back in 2 minutes," Ridge said. He went. 60 yards of open tarmac at a run, boots on wet concrete, the rain cold on his face, the hangar lights ahead. He was in the open for approximately 9 seconds, and the guard was inside, and no one was watching the lot, and 9 seconds was enough. He hit the wall beside the hangar door and stopped, back flat against the metal, breathing, listening. Voices inside. Thorne's voice. He'd heard it for 30 seconds and already recognized its cadence. The voice of a man who expected rooms to configure themselves around his presence. A response from one of the associates, too low to parse. The sound of a door opening somewhere deeper in the hangar. Ridge put his hand on the hangar door's edge and pulled it open 6 inches and looked through. The interior was large and divided. The main bay where the aircraft sat, and a partitioned area on the left that was functioning as a waiting room. 4 chairs, a folding table, a floor lamp giving off the orange light that made everything look like the inside of something that didn't want visitors. Thorne was standing at the table looking at something on a tablet. One associate was beside him. The other associate, the one who'd carried Sophie, was in the far corner, and Sophie was on a chair, still wrapped in the blanket, head down, not moving. The guard was 10 feet from the door on the right side, back to Ridge, watching the aircraft. Ridge looked at Sophie. She wasn't moving, but she was breathing. He could see the slight rise and fall of the blanket. Not unconscious, not the stillness of something worse. Just sedated. Just a child who had been given something to make her compliant and quiet, which was exactly the kind of efficiency that people who move children like cargo arrived at when they'd done it long enough to optimize the process. He looked at Thorne. He looked at the tablet in Thorne's hands, at the reading glasses Thorne had pushed up onto his forehead, at the field coat, at the careful, measured confidence of a man reviewing logistics at midnight in a private hangar, because the logistics were, in his experience, the kind of thing that resolved itself when you had enough money and enough connections and enough years of successful operation to believe that the mechanism was permanent. Ridge stepped inside. He moved left, toward the partition, staying in the shadow between the main bay lighting and the partition lamp. The guard's back was still turned. The associate beside Thorne was looking at the tablet. The associate near Sophie was checking his phone. 12 feet to Sophie. He crossed it in 4 steps and crouched beside the chair and put his hand on the blanket, carefully. And Sophie moved. Not waking, not alert, just the animal response of a small body to the presence of another body. A shift, a slight lean. Ridge looked at her face. She was 5 years old. She had brown hair that needed cutting and a crease on her cheek from the blanket and eyelashes that were still wet from the last time she'd cried. Whenever that had been. However long ago she'd stopped. He picked her up. She was heavier than he expected, the specific solid weight of a sleeping child. And she made a sound when he moved her. Not words, just sound. The sound of someone at the bottom of a medicated sleep registering displacement. And Ridge held her against his shoulder, the way he'd seen Knox hold his daughter 20 years ago at a club picnic. The same configuration, the same instinctive angling of the body to make the child feel contained and not falling. He stood up. The associate near Sophie's chair looked up from his phone. For 1 full second, the 2 men looked at each other across the space of the hangar partition, and the second stretched the way seconds stretched in the field when something had changed and the world was catching up to it. Then the associate said, "Hey," and the hangar door opened behind Ridge with the particular sound of a door being opened by someone with authority to open it, and a voice he didn't recognize said clearly and completely, "Federal agents, nobody move." The room moved anyway. The guard turned, the associate near Thorne reached under his jacket, and Thorne himself looked up from the tablet with the expression of a man whose face was rearranging itself from confidence to calculation in real time, running numbers, assessing exits, finding the angles that 60 years of protected operation had always provided, and discovering that tonight, for reasons he would spend the rest of his life trying to understand, the angles were gone. Ridge pressed Sophie against his shoulder and turned his back to the room and put himself between her and every other person in it, because that was the geometry that mattered, and he held her there while the federal agents came through the door and the night became something official and loud and controlled and no longer his. Knox's voice in the earpiece. "You're clear. Torres has the building." Ridge walked toward the door. An agent, young, tactical vest, hand raised toward him, said, "Sir, stop." "He's ours," Torres's voice, from somewhere to his right, crisp and immediate. "He's with me. Let him through." The agent stepped aside. Ridge walked out of the hangar into the rain. He stood on the wet tarmac with Sophie against his shoulder and the rain coming down on both of them, and the lights of the federal vehicles now visible at the north perimeter, blue and white and red, strobing across the wet ground in patterns that made everything look slightly unreal, the way flashing light always made the aftermath of things look, like a scene being documented rather than lived. He felt Sophie's breathing against his collarbone, slow and regular and alive. Knox was there. He materialized from the dark the way Knox always materialized, quiet for a large man, and he stood beside Ridge and looked at the child and then at Ridge's face and didn't say anything because there was nothing to say that the moment wasn't already saying. Garrett appeared at the perimeter fence, camera still running. He lowered it when he saw them. He exhaled something that wasn't quite a word. Inside the hangar, voices. The controlled loud voices of federal agents establishing authority over a room that had believed until 30 seconds ago it was untouchable. Thorne's voice, distinct even through the hangar walls, not afraid yet but recalibrating, the voice of a man who had survived difficult situations before by virtue of knowing which calls to make. He would be on his phone within minutes if they let him keep his phone, which Torres would not, because Torres had been building this case for 2 years and had not done so by making avoidable errors. Ridge looked down at Sophie. Her eyes were opening, not fully. The sedation was still in her system, still smoothing the edges of consciousness. But enough. Enough to be a child waking up in someone's arms in the rain outside a hangar. Enough to register that the arms were there, that there was a shoulder, that something warm was between her and the cold. She said something. Not words. Just sound, the pre-verbal language of a child too young and too medicated for language right now. Ridge said, "You're okay." He said it quietly, into the top of her head, into the wet brown hair that needed cutting. "You're okay. Nobody's taking you anywhere." Sophie made the sound again and then went quiet against his shoulder, and Ridge stood in the rain in the blue-white-red light of federal intervention and held a 5-year-old he'd met 30 seconds ago and felt the stone in his pocket. The one he'd carried since 1999, since a county van and a caseworker who wouldn't look him in the eye, and a boy who had not had anyone willing to stand in the rain and say, "You're okay, nobody's taking you anywhere," and felt it, for the first time in 27 years, shift. Not gone. Not yet. But no longer stationary. Knox put his hand on Ridge's shoulder blade, briefly, the way he'd done at Marcus's office, and this time Ridge didn't move away from it. Behind them, from inside the hangar, a voice Ridge recognized as Thorne's rose above the others. Not panicked, not broken, but suddenly very aware of the walls that had just closed, and said something to Torres that Ridge couldn't fully hear. Torres's response was 4 words, clear and complete, carrying across the tarmac in the rain like something that had been a long time in transit. "You're done, Mr. Thorne." The rain kept falling. The lights kept strobing. And somewhere north of Salem, on roads the federal units were already covering, Ellen Voss's transport vehicles were being stopped one by one, each child accounted for, each driver processed, each thread of a network that had operated in the dark for 30 years pulled into the light where it could not survive and could not reconstitute and could not, after tonight, pretend it had never existed. And Gerald Thorne, who had sat at charity dinners and foundation boards and funding committees, and had understood himself to be the kind of man that systems protected, the kind of man that consequences did not reach, the kind of man that children in locked rooms could not threaten, stood in a private hangar in the rain outside Salem and heard federal agents read him his rights, and understood for the first time that the mechanism was not permanent. It had just been waiting for someone willing to stand in the rain long enough to break it. Ridge held Sophie against his shoulder. She was breathing. She was warm. She was going to wake up in the morning somewhere safe, and when she did, Ridge Callow was going to be accountable for making sure that safety held, because he had made that accountability real the moment he crossed 60 yards of open tarmac and picked her up, and real was the only kind of thing he'd ever known how to be. He looked at Knox. Knox looked back at him with the stone face, the concrete face, and underneath it, just visible, just enough. The specific expression of a man who had asked something impossible of a friend and watched the friend do it anyway and come back on the other side of it intact. Knox said, "You said 2 minutes." Ridge said, "I was close." Knox looked at the child against Ridge's shoulder. He looked at the hangar where federal agents were processing the arrest of a man who had believed himself unreachable. He looked at the rain on the tarmac and the lights on the fence and the wet Oregon night doing what wet Oregon nights did, which was persist, which was continue, which was offer no opinion on what happened in it, but simply go on and go on and go on. "Yeah," Knox said. And Ridge Callow stood in the rain with a 5-year-old against his shoulder and the stone in his pocket, not quite as heavy as it had been yesterday. And he waited for the morning to come and the last pieces of this to fall into the places they had always been moving toward, and he did not let go. By the time the sun came up, it was over. Not cleanly. Not the way endings came in the stories people told themselves about justice. The sudden clarifying moment, the gavel, the door closing on the right side. It came the way real endings came, which was slowly and in pieces and with considerable paperwork, and it left everyone involved looking like they'd been awake for 30 hours because they had been awake for 30 hours. And the world outside the Federal Processing Center on the north side of Salem looked exactly the same as it had looked the day before, which was the thing about justice that nobody warned you about. The world didn't acknowledge it. The sky didn't change color. The rain kept doing what the rain had been doing. The ordinary machinery of the city ground on without comment. Harlan Voss was arrested at 12:47 a.m. at Brightfield Children's Home by 2 federal agents and a Portland detective who had been handed enough documentation to make the arrest clean and the charge federal. He came out of the building in his robe and slippers and said nothing, which was the behavior of a man who had already called his attorney in his head and was waiting for the call to become real. He did not look like a monster. He looked like a tired man in his late 50s being walked to a car in the rain, which was the thing about the people who did these things that made them so difficult for ordinary systems to catch. They looked like administrators. They looked like someone's neighbor. They looked like nothing at all until you knew what to look for, and by the time you knew what to look for, they had been looking like nothing for 30 years. Commissioner Dale Arnett was arrested at his home in Lake Oswego at 1:15 a.m. His wife stood in the doorway in her bathrobe and watched it happen, with an expression that Ridge, seeing it in Garrett's footage the following day, could not fully read, whether it was shock or the specific exhaustion of a woman who had been not knowing something for a very long time and was now being relieved of the effort. Ellen Voss was taken at a truck stop outside Eugene at 1:40 a.m., when the transport vehicle she was coordinating was flagged by state police working in concert with Torres's federal units. 3 of the 4 Brightfield transport vehicles were stopped before they reached their intermediate destinations. The 4th, a van carrying 6 children toward a group home in Bend that was connected to Carver's network, was intercepted on Highway 20 at 2:08 a.m., 6 children delivered into emergency protective custody before dawn. Lewis Carver surrendered to federal agents at his Portland office at 9 a.m. the following morning, after spending the night calling every number he had and discovering that the numbers had stopped working. He came in with his attorney and a prepared statement and the expression of a man who had decided that cooperation was the most profitable remaining option, which Torres noted was exactly the expression she'd been hoping for, because a man who cooperated was a man who gave her the client list. Gerald Thorne said nothing to anyone. He had known for 30 years that silence was the only currency that consistently held its value, and he spent his first night in federal custody exercising that knowledge with the discipline of a man who had planned for this contingency without ever believing it would arrive. He would have attorneys by morning. He would have the best attorneys money could hire. But what he would not have, what he could not buy or litigate or manage away, was the documentation. Eric's cameras, Ridge's testimony, Maisie's account of the commissioner's name spoken in connection with Sophie's timeline, the paper trail that Pauline had pulled from the licensing chain and that Marcus, in the final accounting of what he owed, had helped to complete. The thread that once pulled had unraveled everything that 30 years of careful construction had built. Thorne would fight it. Men like Thorne always fought it, but the fighting would happen in a federal courtroom under federal jurisdiction outside the state apparatus that Arnett had spent 9 years arranging to protect him. It would happen on ground where his money was a factor and not a resolution. It would happen, and it would take time, and it would cost everyone involved, And at the end of it, the outcome was not guaranteed in the way that outcomes were never guaranteed when powerful men had resources and time. But the network was broken. That was guaranteed. The mechanism, the specific interlocking system of licensed facilities and private transfers and off-system placements and coordinated oversight failures that had been moving children for 30 years, was broken at every joint simultaneously, and broken things of that complexity did not reassemble. The children at Brightfield were in emergency protective custody before sunrise, every one of them accounted for, every one of them assigned an emergency advocate through a process that Torres had coordinated with a branch of the state system that Arnett had not had time to contaminate. Pauline made 6 calls in the first hour after the arrests, activating a network of licensed social workers and child advocates who had been her colleagues before she'd left the system and who were, she said, as angry as she was, which was very angry indeed. Sophie woke up fully at a children's hospital in Salem at 7 a.m., in a room with yellow walls and a window that looked out at a parking lot that was not beautiful but was ordinary. And ordinary was the thing that Sophie had not had in a very long time. A nurse was there. A female agent from Torres's team who had a face that was good at being calm was there. And Ridge was there, in a chair in the corner that was too small for him, still in his riding gear, still rain-damp at the collar, with the particular stillness of a man who has been awake through something large and has not yet had the distance to understand its full shape. Sophie looked at the yellow walls. She looked at the window. She looked at Ridge in the corner, and Ridge looked back at her and did not move because moving felt like a thing that required permission from the moment, and the moment wasn't giving it yet. She said, "Where's Maisie?" Ridge said, "She's coming." Maisie arrived at the hospital at 8:15 with Dex and Pauline. She came through the door of Sophie's room and stopped, and Sophie was sitting up in the bed by then, and for a moment neither of them moved, the older child and the younger child regarding each other across the yellow room with the specific solemnity of people who have shared something that language does not fully fit. Then Maisie crossed the room and climbed onto the bed beside Sophie, and Sophie leaned against her, and Maisie put her arm around the smaller girl with the automatic authority of someone who had been doing this specific act of small protection, for a very long time inside a locked building where no adult was coming, and the room held it, and Ridge looked at the window, and Dex looked at the floor, and Pauline did not look at anything because she was looking at her phone to give herself something to do with her face. Nobody said anything. There was nothing to say that the moment wasn't already saying. The diner was called Patsy's, which was not a remarkable name for a diner, and it sat on a corner in southeast Portland with a neon sign that had been missing its P since 2019, and a menu that had not changed in 11 years, and coffee that was too strong and too hot and exactly right. It opened at 6 in the morning, and by 7:15 on the morning after the arrests, the back corner booth contained Knox Mercer and Dex Harrow and Pauline Birch and Garrett Reese, all of them in the specific state of exhaustion that sat on the other side of adrenaline like a country you arrived in after a long flight, depleted, slightly disoriented, more aware of hunger and the smell of coffee than you'd been in 24 hours. Ridge arrived at 7:30 after the hospital, after Torres had finished the preliminary interview that would begin the long, formal process of his testimony, after he'd made a call to a family law attorney whose number Pauline had given him and who had agreed to handle the emergency guardianship paperwork with the speed that the situation required. He came in through the diner door with rain on his jacket and sat down in the booth across from Knox and put both hands around the coffee mug that the waitress had already poured without being asked, because she'd been watching the back corner booth for an hour and understood that these were people who needed coffee to arrive automatically. Nobody spoke for a moment. The diner did its morning work around them. The short order cook on the griddle, the waitress refilling tables, the door opening and closing with the rhythm of a neighborhood starting its day. And the back corner booth sat inside all of that ordinary motion like a stone in a stream, solid and separate and exactly where it needed to be. Knox looked at Ridge across the table. He looked at him the way Knox looked at things he was assessing, and what he appeared to assess was that Ridge Callow was intact, which was not the same as undamaged, but was the relevant condition for the morning after. "Sophie," Knox said, "she's going to be okay." Ridge said it the way you said things you believed but couldn't yet fully hold. "It's going to take time. Pauline has people. Good people." He paused. "She asked for Maisie first thing." Knox nodded. Dex said, to the table generally, "How long did you sit in that hospital room?" "A while," Ridge said. Dex nodded like that was a complete answer, which it was. Garrett wrapped both hands around his mug and looked out the window at the corner, at the wet street and the early morning traffic beginning to build. "Thorne's attorneys filed at 6 a.m., he said. "Torres texted me. It's going to be a long process." "Will it hold?" Pauline asked. "The case?" "Yes." Garrett said it without hesitation, which meant he'd been running the calculation since midnight. "We gave her everything clean. My documentation, Ridge's testimony, Maisie's account, the paper trail you built, Marcus's cooperation. The infiltration of her investigation is actually going to help her. It demonstrates the depth of the conspiracy, the level of coordination. Arnett's connection to Thorne going back 23 years. It holds." He paused. "It holds." The booth absorbed that. The coffee was too strong and too hot, and nobody complained about it. Pauline said without looking up from her mug, "Marcus." The name sat in the air. Knox said, "That's not tonight's conversation." "No," Pauline agreed, "but it'll come." "It'll come," Knox said, "and we'll have it, but not tonight." Ridge looked at his coffee. He thought about Marcus's face when he'd said "my son," the two words dropping like something released from a height. He thought about the specific way people made terrible choices for the people they loved, and how the terribleness of the choice didn't erase the love, and the love didn't erase the terribleness, and how you lived in that space without clean resolution, because clean resolution was not a thing the world reliably provided. He didn't say any of that. He drank his coffee and let Knox's verdict stand, because Knox was right. It wasn't tonight's conversation, and tonight had been enough. The waitress brought eggs without being asked, because she'd been watching and she understood, and the booth received them the way people received food after a long night, with the specific gratitude of bodies that had forgotten they were hungry until the hunger was directly in front of them. At some point, Dex started talking about a transmission problem he'd been having with his truck for 3 weeks, and Garrett asked a question about it that was technically coherent for someone who knew almost nothing about transmissions, and Knox offered an opinion that was probably correct. And the booth became, briefly, a booth in a diner in the morning and not a field hospital or a command post or an aftermath. Ridge sat in it and let it happen, let the ordinary texture of people who knew each other well, doing the small rituals of existing together, wash over the night that was behind them. After a while, he reached into his jacket pocket. He put the Iron Saints cut on the booth table between them. Not his current one, the old one, the one Maisie had been wrapped in when he'd found her, which he'd picked up from the garage before leaving for Salem and had been carrying since without knowing exactly why. It was worn at the collar and soft from years on the nail, and had his road name stitched on the front in the slightly uneven letters of someone who had done it themselves. He looked at it. He thought about Maisie wrapped in it at 5 in the morning on a restored Harley, looking at him with eyes that had already survived too much, and were doing the calculation of whether he was worth the risk. He thought about what it had cost her to walk barefoot through a Portland February to find a garage she'd only heard about, from some child's whisper, or some overheard fragment, some improbable piece of information that had lodged in a 7-year-old's mind as a destination. A place where someone might be. A place worth the risk of trying. He picked up the cut and stood up from the booth and looked at Knox, who looked back at him with the neutral expression that meant Knox already knew what was happening and had no objection. "I'll be back," Ridge said. He drove to the hospital. He took the elevator to the 2nd floor. He knocked on the door of the yellow room, and Maisie's voice said, "Come in," and he came in, and both girls were awake, Maisie sitting cross-legged on the bed, and Sophie beside her with a hospital breakfast tray that she was investigating with the cautious curiosity of a child who had not had reliable meals for long enough that food had become something to examine before trusting. Ridge stood inside the door. He looked at Maisie. She looked back at him with those dark, steady eyes that had never once in the 3 days he'd known her shown him anything unguarded, anything undefended, anything that hadn't been first measured and approved for release. He held out the cut. Maisie looked at it. She looked at him. "This is yours now," Ridge said, "if you want it." She was quiet for a moment, not hesitating. Maisie rarely hesitated. He'd learned that much. She was doing the thing she did, the reading of the situation, the calculation of what was real and what was offered, and whether the distance between those two things was survivable. Then she reached out and took it. She pulled it across her shoulders, and it fell to her knees on both sides, and the sleeves covered her hands completely. And she sat in it like it was a thing she'd been looking for in the specific shape of it, without knowing that was what she was looking for. Sophie looked at the cut. She reached out one small hand and touched the leather at Maisie's elbow, gently, the way children touch things they wanted to understand. Ridge said, "I talked to a lawyer this morning about guardianship. It's going to take some time. There's paperwork, and the courts will have opinions, and Pauline is going to help navigate it, but I want you to know the direction things are going." He paused. He was aware that he was not a man built for speeches, that the words available to him were insufficient for what they were being asked to carry. He let the insufficiency stand. "Both of you," he said. "The direction involves both of you." Maisie looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "Okay, just that." One word, delivered in the tone of a child who had made a decision and did not require further deliberation. The tone of someone who had been waiting for a thing to be real and had just determined that it was. Ridge nodded. He looked at the window, at the parking lot outside, at the ordinary gray Portland morning doing what Portland mornings did without apology or explanation. He thought about Knox in the diner booth, about Dex and Pauline and Garrett and the transmission problem and the too-strong coffee and the eggs that arrived without being asked. He thought about the cut across Maisie's shoulders and the small hand Sophie had placed on the leather, and the particular weight that had been in his pocket for 27 years. He could still feel it. He didn't expect it to be gone, but it was different now, the way something is different when it has finally been used for the purpose it was carrying. Not lighter, exactly, but no longer stationary. No longer just a stone. Something else. Something that had moved. He walked to the chair in the corner and sat down, and the yellow room held all three of them in the quiet of the morning, and outside the window Portland went about its business, and the Harleys were parked and cold and waiting, and Ridge Callow sat in a too-small chair beside a window in a hospital room and watched two small people eat breakfast. And for the first time in 27 years, he was exactly where he was supposed to be, doing exactly what he was supposed to be doing, and there was nothing left to outrun. The morning came all the way in, and it was enough.